before we do our centering time, let me do the formal introduction, because I'm very excited. For the first time, we have a person out of our national offices coming and meeting with us, and I'm just so excited about that because, right, we meet at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., but for somebody out of the national office, that's afternoon and evening, and I feel a little guilty asking somebody to give away evening time for us, but Dr. Erica Dollhopf has graciously said she would do that. She is, Dr. Erica is the director, I want to get her title correct here, director of the Center for Analytic Research in Development and Data, or CARDD, if you're familiar with that acronym out of the national offices. This is the group that breaks down the data and the statistics and gives us some wonderful trends, both within the United Church of Christ and within religion life in the USA as a whole, and helps us to know where to focus our time and energy and things of that nature. Some of you have been around as long as I have, some of you a little longer. I'm not pointing out anybody, but I know that. And you will know there was a point as the national offices did some transitioning into smaller staffs that the predecessor to CARDD was one of the first things kind of done away with. And then later on, CARDD was created. We were flying blind during that period. And so it's so exciting to have somebody like Erica who gets excited about data and can interpret that data to us. So that is what you will be doing today. The national offices did a survey of COVID-19, its impact on UCC churches. This is a piece specific to UCC, and so Dr. Erica will be walking through that survey and unpacking the trends that are there, and she'll say more about that when we turn the time over to her. I'm like a giddy child at Christmas. Woo, I'm so excited. So thank you, Erica, for being with us today. Let us enter our centering time. And I have to admit that when I pulled this together, New Year's was on my mind. And I'm feeling a little left-handed because I'm thinking I wish I had done something around democracy or being decent or something of that nature. So if if your emotions are in DC right now, take whatever you can take from this. Place it in that context, even though the context that I have developed here is New Year. So I invite you to bring your emotions into this and not necessarily let what I plan to narrow it down if you need something broader. Hear these words out of the first chapter of James, verses 16 through 18. Make no mistake about this, my dear sisters and brothers. Every worthwhile gift, every genuine benefit comes from above, descending from the creator of the heavenly luminaries, who cannot change and is never in shadow. God willingly gave birth to us with a word spoken in truth, so that we may be, as it were, the first fruits of God's creation. Here now 3 haikus on New Year's. The first is from Yosef Busan, who passed away in 1783. And it indicates that New Year's always are born out of old years. The old calendar fills me with gratitude like a song. The next 2 haikus were written by Matsuo Basho, who passed away in 1694. New Year's Day, sun on every field is beloved. Another year, hat in hand, sandals on my feet. And now let us be in prayer. Of the particular prayer that I'll be lifting up was written by Vanita White. God of all time, help us enter the new year quietly, thoughtful of who we are to ourselves and to others, mindful that our steps make an impact and our words carry power. May we walk gently. May we speak only after we have listened well. Creator of all life, help us enter the new year reverently, aware that you have endowed every creature and plant, every person and habitat with beauty and purpose. May we regard the world with tenderness. May we honor rather than destroy. Lover of our souls, help us enter the new year joyfully, willing to laugh and dance and dream, remembering our many gifts with thanks and looking forward to the blessings yet to come. May we welcome your lavish love. In this new year, may the grace and peace of Christ bless us now and in the days ahead. Amen. And with that, Erica, let's turn it over to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, David. And thank you for welcoming me here. I'm really thrilled to be here. I really love talking with local church pastors. And in fact, most of our CARDD meetings, we actually remind each other that we serve the local church, because at the end of the day, we collect our data, we do the survey research. We do what we do because we serve the local church and we want to help you in the ministries that you're doing. So it's my privilege to be here, and I'm really excited to share with you some of the results of our COVID-19 data. You may be most familiar with our office through the annual yearbook data collection, and for that, I thank you so much for submitting your data. I know it is often a little bit of work to put it together, and we are so grateful for the time that you take to do that and for the data itself, because that helps us to understand things like long-term trends. It helps us to know, where, different things are happening in different churches. And also, this is what helps us with the historical record. And so when we're trying to understand what's been happening over 10, 20, 50 years, it's this year by year data that ultimately shapes that. So thank you. We're really grateful. And we use that data pretty much every day. So we're so thankful for the time that you take to put that together, because I know it is a little bit of work. So like I said, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our COVID-19 survey. So this was a survey that we took a sample of our senior and solo clergy, senior solo pastors of congregations, to talk about what their congregations' experiences are like. And so if any of you filled this out, thank you. We really appreciate your time. And also, some of you might have an opportunity, actually all of you will have an opportunity to fill this out if you're completing your congregation's annual yearbook data collection, some additional COVID-19 information. As you may be familiar, we've actually introduced a supplemental survey with our yearbook data collection, and this lets us ask some things beyond our typical yearbook data and things that aren't exactly in the data hub. And for this year, one of the most important things for us is that we're measuring in-person and online worship attendance separately, and we always will, because we know those really reflect different things. And I'll talk about that some more in the presentation. So all of the online worship attendance is in the supplemental survey, but in addition, we're also repeating some of the questions that are on the survey that I'll be presenting about, and that will let us see about 6 months apart what happened in our churches, what trends are persisting. And so that's in the supplemental survey. So if you have an opportunity when you're submitting your yearbook data, we would be so thankful for your response and your time on that. And that will help us for our next phase of reporting on what's been happening with our church and COVID-19. So that being said, let's talk about our current survey. This is also available online, and I will be giving you a link to that. That's on our CARDD webpage. So let's get this started. All right, so as you can see, the date of this report is December 2020. We collected the data on this in August and September. So this is actually for us a relatively quick time turnaround for our timeline. Usually it takes a while to process the data and analyze the data. But we knew this was really important to get out to our churches, so we made sure that we got this out as quickly as possible. This was the Christmas gift I wanted to give, is getting this report out. So we released this in early December, and we're hoping to have some follow-up reports in the next few months that give you some further detail, such as looking at our responses by conference and region, by looking at church size, and also our church context, because we know that our churches in rural settings are probably experiencing very different things than our churches in urban settings, and our churches that are somewhere in between. So we will be hopefully be able to release some further data in the next couple of months. So in this particular survey, in this report, we're focusing on three main things: the impact on worship, the impact on gathering and giving, and also the impact of COVID-19 on our clergy. Um, so this is really, like I said, this is sort of the first preliminary report. We'll be diving in deeper in our next reports. And we're also trying to use this as the first in a series of surveys and studies so we can really understand the effects long term. We know that even when hopefully the pandemic starts to become less of a daily reality in our lives, the impact of the pandemic are going to persist. So I would anticipate that we will be collecting data on this in some form, probably for at least the next 5 years, and trying to understand what are some of the ongoing impacts of COVID-19. So like I said, this was a survey conducted from a sample of senior and solo and co-pastors and designated term pastors and interim pastors in the UCC. We had a fairly high response rate, which we appreciated. And this, I think importantly, this does reflect data from mid-August through mid-September 2020. And as we know, so many things have happened since then. And what the reality is for churches that's reflected in this data may not be what's happened since. And we know this, is sort of an ever-changing thing. So just something to remember when looking at the data, that some of this is just reflective of a particular time and place, and doesn't necessarily capture what's going on right now, but it does capture what happened in our somewhat recent past. So first, let's talk a little bit about changes to in-person worship. So one of the big trends that we found is that most of our churches in the UCC stopped worshiping in person at point due to COVID-19. In fact, 95% of our churches stopped worship at some point. So that suggests that really, not being able to worship in person was really an extremely common experience across the UCC and our congregations. Now, of those that stopped worship, which is virtually all of our churches, quite a few of those, at least at this time of the survey, had still not resumed in-person worship. So it's the majority, over 50% had not resumed in-person worship. About 40% had. A couple of notes on this. Of course, we don't know the churches that may have resumed worship and then stopped worship after the survey, or the churches that maybe started worship again. Something else to note is that we don't really know what type of in-person worship this is, because we understand that it's very different for our churches that are worshiping, say, in person and outside, and in person versus inside. And so, for instance, the church that I go to, we did have outdoor worship on Christmas Eve. They're only doing outdoor worship, and it was 20 degrees and it was snowing. But they are holding socially distanced outdoor worship regardless of the weather. But we know that's sort of a different circumstance and different things to consider than if you're inside when it's 20 degrees and snowing. So um, I'm imagining you probably don't have to deal with a lot of snow in Hawaii, but there may be other factors that people are trying to consider in how to hold in-person worship if they're holding it at all. So we asked churches whether they're currently worshiping in person or if they're planning to resume worshiping in person, what kind of measures they're implementing. And so we can see there's a few things that really jump out here. Spacing between people in the worship area was the most common thing that churches were doing, and almost as common was no passing of offering plates. Also extremely common was the no physical passing of peace, having hand sanitizer stations, requiring mask wearing, not offering food or beverages before or after church. Most of our churches were engaging in extra cleaning, not having choir, modified communion. And so from this list, one thing we were hoping is not only showing what our churches are doing, but also for churches that are looking to see, what might they want to do trying to figure out maybe what are some of the most common practices. We're hoping that some of this data can also answer some of those questions. And in fact, in our supplemental survey, we took some of our learnings from this and actually offered some additional questions, such as, are churches worshiping outside? Some of the churches I know have been having drive-in worship and are broadcasting it over the radio in the parking lot while people drive in their cars. And so we're trying to ask some questions that accommodate some of the really innovative and different ways that people are modifying worship in order to be in person and safely during the pandemic. So we also know that online worship has been huge during the pandemic. And let's see, so 86% of our churches have actually been worshiping online since the COVID-19 pandemic. And of those, most churches were sharing live worship, or about 40% were sharing pre-recorded worship. I think this is another question where when it was asked might impact what the responses are, because as we know, as different places have different restrictions, recording live worship might not be an option in some cases. So I would anticipate that this number may shift over time. One thing I think is really important to note is that only 9% of our churches worshiped online before the pandemic. And so from the 9% that were worshiping before the pandemic to the 86% that have reported worshiping online since the pandemic, that's an 855% increase in online worship. So that is a huge jump in the types of worship that are being offered currently in our churches, or at least at some point during the pandemic. Notably, we only asked if on our previous question, if they've worshiped online at any time. We actually don't know if this is an ongoing thing or something that churches are just doing when they weren't able to physically get into the building or for other reasons. But we do know that at least 86% of our churches have tried online worship and have done some form of online worship, at least for periods of time or on an ongoing basis. And I'm going to skip over a slide to something I think is heavily connected, is that we know we've had this huge increase in online worship, and of course one of the questions that we hear often is, will this persist? And I think so far our data has us, gives us reason to believe that it will persist. Over 3/4 of our churches reported that they were planning to continue using the technology that they adopted during the pandemic after the pandemic. Now, of course, this could mean maybe churches, not all of these churches will continue online worship, but I think what this does mean is that we may see increasingly some virtual fellowship, or perhaps some more committee meetings held online rather than in person. So I think this is something I'm curious to see, in what way it unfolds after the pandemic. But only 2% of our churches said that they were not planning to continue using any technology. About 10% said they were unsure, but I think that our new ways of meeting and gathering virtually are going to be here in some way, shape, or form into the future. Now, back to that previous slide, we know that some of our churches, of course, were worshiping online before the pandemic. So we asked them what has changed for them since COVID-19. Almost all of them, 90%, reported that they now have higher attendance for their online worship services. The other number I think is really important here is that over half of these churches reported adding additional platforms for online worship. So we did ask people what platforms they were using. And one thing that actually surprised me is how many of our churches are actually using more than one platform. Now, since we know this is a trend, we didn't ask this on this survey, but one thing we're interested in being able to correlate is whether having multiple platforms actually increases your online worship attendance. This is somewhat complicated. As many of you probably know, online worship attendance is measured a little bit differently depending on what platform you're on, and I'll talk about that more shortly. But we'd like to start understanding sort of what do some of these trends mean, especially for churches, trying to decide things like, we're already on Zoom. Is it worth trying to upload this to YouTube? Or like, what's the impact of that? So online worship platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Facebook Live, and Zoom were all pretty frequently used, and actually used in almost equal measure in some ways, within 15% of each other. You notice there is an other category, and in that category, Vimeo is the most popular service, but generally most churches are using these three main platforms. Almost 40% of our churches reported using at least 2 of these platforms, and almost 9% reported using all 3. Like I said, that was a lot more than I was anticipating. So we're going to be continuing to look at this to see what this actually means. So as you probably figure, like I said, this measuring numbers on this are a little bit different for each platform. So in CARDD, we're actually going to be, we're offering guidelines to churches for measuring online worship attendance, and we're actually offering platform-specific guidelines. And this will be available with our yearbook materials. I'm not sure if it's on our yearbook website yet or not, but if not, it should be very, very shortly. So again, a little bit more with attendance. As you may know, you can't really compare in-person attendance to online attendance. And there's a few reasons for that, including if somebody's online, one device might mean one person. It also might mean 3 people or 5 people, and there's not always a way to know that. Sometimes on Zoom you can tell, but if you're on YouTube, for instance, you really have no way to know. In addition, say you're on Facebook and you're looking at your Facebook Live numbers, sometimes people are only watching for a few seconds. And sometimes it's hard to tell, is this an actual person watching? Is this a bot that's watching? It's really hard to tell what translates into individual people. And even on YouTube, we know that a service could be accessed the day it's uploaded, and the service could be accessed on a Tuesday evening, and it could be accessed a year from when the service was posted. So there's also questions there about when do you actually measure the online worship attendance numbers. So we've sought to answer some of these questions. And in fact, we're working on this with some of our wider faith community partners, because of course we're not the only ones trying to figure out how to measure online worship. So there's this itty bitty organization that myself and Destiny Heisey in our office belong to, called the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies. And it's essentially people with their jobs in different faith communities. And Destiny actually was part of a task force earlier this fall, with a number of people from our different denominational partners, trying to figure out what are best practices for measuring online worship attendance, not only to help each other, but also to come up with some standard way of doing this. So not only will our numbers be internally consistent at the UCC, but hopefully when we're trying to understand how our numbers compare to numbers of, say, the Episcopal Church or the ELCA or other faith communities, we have some way of knowing that our numbers were being counted in somewhat similar ways. So this is something I think we've been really thinking about, how to measure worship attendance probably since at least June or July. We've been thinking about this for most of the year, since it became apparent that online worship was going to persist for quite a while during the pandemic. So one of the interesting things we found is when we asked who is attending your online worship services. So not surprisingly, in most cases, it's current members who are attending. But we also found that family or friends of current members were frequently attending. People who had never been connected to your church were finding them online. They're often attending. Former members were attending. People interested in becoming members were attending. And something that's not listed here, it was in the other comments, but we're asking about more specifically in the supplemental survey, is we also found that it was fairly common for the family and friends of clergy or some of their colleagues to attend their service. So for instance, if you have a friend who's a pastor of another church, you're probably not going to each other's churches on Sundays because you're probably at your own church holding your own service. But if you're having worship online, it's much easier to go see, your friend's sermon, or, to be part of, a service that's being held. So we also saw that's actually a trend for our clergy, is their family and friends and colleagues are attending their services more often. Like I said, just a quick reminder, and you can see this on this slide, we will be offering guidelines on measuring online worship. And also just a reminder too, whenever you're submitting your data, we are not collecting in the same place our in-person numbers and our online numbers. We know, unfortunately, our in-person numbers are so impacted by so many things this year. And, in some cases, churches couldn't meet online, or they might have had to have caps on attendance. And so I think something to remember that we all try to remind ourselves when we look at these numbers and anticipate them is there's probably going to be a big asterisk in all of our data for this year, because we know the numbers are just not going to look the same as they would any other year. I mean, you almost really can't compare in-person attendance in 2020 to in-person attendance in every other year. So we're going to do the best we can in reporting, what happened, and just knowing that we know this year or 2020 won't look the same as other years. And also, we will always keep our in-person and online attendance separate, since those we feel really are measured different ways and represent very different things. So, of course, some of our churches are not able to worship online for a variety of reasons. And so we asked those, if they're not worshiping online and if they're not worshiping in person, what are they doing? And we found in many of those cases that those churches were finding a variety of ways to be able to engage their congregations. Most commonly, this took the form of providing a written sermon. Sometimes this was an audio or video sermon. There was a variety of other things that were being done. I know one church, they were sending out devotionals to their members and finding other ways to keep people, their community engaged, and nourish them spiritually. One thing I would note is that I think an important number in here is that um, fewer than 5% of these churches who are not providing in-person or online worship said that they weren't doing anything. And I think that's notable in that, to me, this suggests that our churches, by and large, are trying to find ways to be church even in the midst of a really challenging situation. And, even though I know it's been, such a tremendously difficult year, they're finding still ways to be a community and to nourish one another. So I think that's actually quite hopeful, is that even in this most difficult of years, so many of our churches have found a way to adapt, and, a lot of different ways to adapt. So, of course, gathering and giving are two other really big things that have been impacted by COVID-19. So, first, let's talk a little bit about gathering. And this we talk, these are things that are not necessarily your worship service, but things like adult education or outreach, committee meetings. And we found, as far as Christian education went, the most common response is that options were moved online. In some cases, these were not moved on, they were offered in person and not online. In other cases, they were never offered in person. So it's really irrelevant whether or not they were offered online. But this seems to be fairly common with Christian education, is that it transitioned to being an online option. The biggest transition to online offerings actually was with our committee meetings, and 70% of those moved online in response to COVID-19. So that's actually one thing I will be curious to see if that trend persists after the pandemic. If in on a Wednesday night, if that's one less trip out that people need to make if they continue to meet online after the pandemic. Bible studies too also frequently moved online in response to COVID-19. Finally, our outreach groups also pretty commonly moved online in response to COVID-19. And actually, as far as outreach goes, something else I find, a little bit of hope in what's been such a dark and difficult year is that 70% of our congregations reported that they've either continued or expanded their outreach, community service, or social justice work. So I thought this is actually, pretty exciting, that even though when we know many people's resources are thinning and there's, so many challenges and difficulties, that so many of our churches are not only continuing their work, but they're actually expanding their work. So I thought that was actually something really exciting that our churches have been doing in the midst of the pandemic. Of course, church giving is another big topic. And I would say overall, it seems like there's really different experiences depending on the church. So about 40% of our churches experienced a decline in giving. However, about 40% of our churches reported that giving has stayed about the same. And then the remaining 20% actually saw an increase in giving. So what this suggests to me is that experiences are really varied in terms of giving in churches. And for some churches, there's been increases. Some churches, there's been decreases. Some churches really haven't seen any difference. And so this is this is actually one thing I'm particularly interested to see how that's affected by things like region and context and church size. To see if we can have a little bit better understanding of which of our churches are most severely impacted by changes to giving during COVID-19. I know something else that's been mentioned to me that we're hoping to be able to track with our supplemental survey, our second wave of COVID-19 data collection, is that we know that some churches are disproportionately impacted because they had rental space that was often used for events or things that are just not happening because of the pandemic. And so we would anticipate that those churches also might be particularly financially impacted, but we haven't really captured that yet. So this is, on the list of things that we really, want to better understand. As far as electronic giving, this is something that we've certainly seen increase as a result of the pandemic. Although actually quite a few of our congregations were offering online giving before the start of the pandemic. Overall, either before or since, almost 2/3 of our congregations have been offering electronic giving options. And we know from previous surveys, even prior to the pandemic, that electronic giving options tends to increase the per person giving in a congregation. And so this is something that I would, I will be interested to see if this has any impact on, also that last question on church giving, because we know that in a non-pandemic time, it does have an impact, but of course things are different in the pandemic. Something we will be collecting data on in the supplemental survey is what online giving platform people are using. Because we also know that churches are trying to figure out, what do people use, what's common, trying to figure out what might work for them. So we're hoping that as we collect some of this information, this might be useful for congregations to know, what's out there, what are people using, things that options that they might want to explore. Finally, a little over half of our congregations did apply for the Payroll Protection Plan from the SBA. And if one of your congregations did this and you were filling out your yearbook information, we did determine that this should be included in your church's annual income. We were trying to consider similar cases, and we decided that if a church had received a grant or something similar, we would include that in a church's total yearly income. So if your church did receive this, know that for the yearbook forms that you can include that in the income section. So finally, our last topic is the impact on clergy. So the first thing we looked at here was what resources are our clergy using for their decision making around gathering in person for worship. And the thing that is really striking to me here is what an important central role our conferences have been playing for our local churches. As you can see, conferences are actually the most common response. In fact, they are more common than the CDC for getting information. So I think this is really a testament to what great work our conferences have been doing for our local churches, and also just underscores the importance of our conference offices. I know we're grateful for them at CARDD. We couldn't do our work without them, and I know they've been indispensable for our churches during the pandemic. So of course you can see in the list that, state and local health departments have been important. Federal officials have really not been relied on very much for decision making. But yeah, our conference offices really have been tremendously central to this whole decision-making process, and we're really thankful to them for all the information that they've been providing. Of course, we also wanted to know, what is the impact on clergy support? And so one of the things we asked here is, what do our clergy need? And not surprising, I think, with the vast increase in online offerings is that most of our clergy said that they needed some support or assistance in technology. Also, really common answers were they needed help with pastoral care strategies and also faith formation resources. As far as who has been most helpful in supporting our clergy during COVID-19, congregation members were the most common response. However, our second most common response was the conference. So again, we can really see what a central role our conference offices have played for our local churches in all of this. And I think notably number 3 there is other local clergy. And one other thing we saw in this survey is just how important it's been for our clergy to have a network of clergy friends, not only within the UCC, but outside the UCC and even in other faith traditions in order to have some peer support. And in fact, clergy colleagues was the most common response for where our clergy were receiving pastoral care during COVID-19. And of course, second highest is the conference. So we know the conference has been playing multiple roles here. They've really been providing support. They've been providing information. And so, like I said, I think one of the important things that did emerge from this survey is just how, crucial our conference offices have been for our local churches during this crisis. So we know that our churches have been, they've had to adapt to a lot, and it's been a very difficult time. But we're also, I think it's also exciting that even in the midst of all this difficulty, we've seen our churches be really innovative and, pivot to meet some new challenges. I think it's also been notable how much technology has really played a central role, and I think that's something that not only hopefully this is somewhere we can continue to offer more assistance to our clergy on, but I think something that we should keep an eye on for the future, because I would anticipate that this role of technology is going to persist even after the pandemic. Like I said, we are working on some additional reports, and we're hoping to be able to report to you on what's happening more specifically with by conference and geography, church size, and church setting. And we are also going to be offering, conducting surveys over time. So we have our supplemental survey. And again, if you have time to fill that out with your yearbook data collection, we would be so tremendously grateful. That will help us to continue to report on this. And I would expect that we will continue to collect this data, not only within the UCC, but we are hoping to do some additional work in partnership with other denominational offices. Something that I'm hoping we can also study this year is clergy wellness, and also the effects of clergy burnout during the pandemic. We know that's been a really critical topic, and that's something I'm hoping that we'll be able to do a separate survey on this year. So that is our initial COVID-19 report. I am really very happy to answer whatever questions you have, both about this or if you have questions about our UCC data in general.
Thank you, Erica, for the presentation and for the information in that survey. Are there questions for Erica around this, around trends that you might want to pick her brain about, or as she has opened up things and other things within the yearbook data as well?
Yeah, I was wondering, with all of the information that you got, do you folks provide a touch point within the national setting where local congregations can share their information on their online service portals that they're utilizing or processes that they're utilizing, so that others can, so you don't have to duplicate the effort of trying to find that resource?
Can you give me like a specific example of something that you were thinking of?
Okay, like say for instance, some people have started on Facebook Live where others have been doing YouTube, and obviously YouTube streaming has to use back office kind of software and for delivery into social media. So how has there been something that your office has been doing to try to help collect all of this information so that local churches can utilize these resources rather than trying to go search on Google?
Yeah. Our office hasn't put that together, but I think there have been some resources that Faith Info in Mesa may have put together on this. And I know that in our, Faith Info has been doing their webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I know that some of those have addressed some of that. So we don't have the data, but I would check those offices to see what they're offering. I know that's been a common thing across so many of our churches is, we're all trying to use the same technology.
Trying to go off of what Ken was saying, I'm wondering if either on a national level or maybe conference level, if there's a licensure that we can all use for some of these programs to help those churches who cannot afford to purchase some of these larger online support systems and so forth. If at a national level, we might be able to do that to support the smaller churches.
That's a great question, and I know one of the things that we're actually focusing on in CARDD right now over the next few years with our research and development efforts is specifically trying to support our small churches, our rural churches, our communities of color, and also our new church starts. So we're really trying to be deliberate in knowing that, you know, our small churches just don't have access always to as many resources as our large churches. Again, I think that probably Faith Info might have more information on that, or Mesa. That Yeah, I'm trying to think. I know they've been trying to coordinate, you know, a lot of resources for churches. So I think either one of those offices would probably be helpful to reach out to. And if they're not doing that, I think that's a great idea to share with them.
You know, maybe my church might be a one-off, but we still have the same problems or issues or concerns. Like some of our members have become homeless since, because they lost their jobs, or domestic violence has occurred now. And so, and even though we don't open our facilities, we still are trying to lead them to resources within our state or nationally to try to help. But sometimes the help doesn't come fast enough. It's not something maybe you can answer, but I think that your statistics will find the escalation in these kinds of stress level issues that have arisen since. And you know, we at local church level are the ones that are getting impacted, because we have to continue to be a guiding hand, yet we don't have the capacity to do those types of psychological and other kinds of needs programs for them. So I think nationally you folks should have resources, right? Because I know the conference has them also.
Yeah, I know we do have, we have a database now of the resources that are offered across national that you can search. So I know that's, you know, kind of one direction that we've tried to head in you know, actually just helping people become aware of what's offered. We did a national asset mapping project in the last couple of years, and trying to figure out what are all the resources that the UCC offers at national, and then figuring out, have our churches actually heard of these resources, and are they using them? And if they use them, is it helpful? And we actually did this survey. It was around the time of, it was right before last General Synod, so it was in 2019. And we actually found that one of the biggest challenges is that most of our churches haven't heard of most of our resources. So we've been trying to figure out how we can actually make that pipeline a little bit easier. So yeah, that's, I know that there's a wide variety of resources offered at national, and I know sometimes some of the challenge is actually just knowing what's there.
I had asked a question earlier of Erica about how, using her crystal ball, how she felt that COVID was helping us redefine what it means to be church. And she answered, so if I'm quoting you wrong, Erica, please correct me. But you answered, or at least what I wrote down was, it's redefining how what we consider community, what we consider in terms of being physically present as something broader than just being physically present with each other. And I want to follow up on that, because that to me speaks to this issue of intimacy. Do you think that intimacy is being redefined as well, as to what we think of intimacy and how we experience that in collegial ways?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, you know, it's certainly different online than it is in person. I think we're discovering that there's still ways to be close and to work closely together online. In fact, one of our staff members, our ambassador for innovation and engagement, Piwa Langeni, they joined our staff in April last year, and I've actually never met them in person. We did the entire hiring process online, partially due to some external circumstances and partially due to COVID. And when it became clear that we weren't going to be back at the national offices for a long time, we onboarded them and, you know, trained them and got them part of the staff in person or online. And, you know, it's funny, they've been part of our staff now for almost a year. And sometimes when we're in staff meetings, you know, we work so closely as a team, and we've been able to find ways to work so fluidly together as a team that once in a while, one of us remarks like, and we've still never met you in person. But I think, that's actually been a pleasant surprise, as I'm sure interactions, they're always different with everybody when you're in person than when you're online, and you can't always get the same type of, information, I guess, from someone else. I mean, you're missing, half your body language, and there's sometimes delays and other things that gets in the way. But I think one of the surprises that I found is that there are still ways to cultivate, closeness and collegiality. And, in some ways, I think my team, and I, can only speak for my team, but I think we're closer now than we've ever been, as colleagues, because we've had to be so intentional about, trying to find ways to meet and talk to each other. So we actually have these coffee breaks now twice a week that we hadn't had before the pandemic. And prior, to the pandemic, I was traveling very heavily. I would see them maybe once a month, once every 2 months in Cleveland. And I do miss seeing them in person, but that's actually been replaced now with I talk to each of them multiple times a week, and we make some time to chat with each other, both as colleagues and as human beings, just sharing what's going on in our lives, the way you might if you ran into somebody in the kitchen, you were making yourself a cup of coffee. We've tried to replicate that. And so, I would think that the way we think about, being collegial is going to change. And I think it's, the same strategies for in person don't really always work online. But I think I think we can discover ways of, being close to one another, even if we're not face to face.
Thank you, Erica. We're almost to the top of our hour. If there another burning question to ask, please do so now. Well, thank you all for your time this afternoon. That's good conversations and good questions that we'll hold in mind and follow up on as best as we can as well. Thank you, Erica, for being with us your evening time there and giving us a piece of your wisdom. Manoa, is that the correct word? Manao? Nobody's helping me. Thank you all. I feel like a flag waving out in the wind now, trying to figure out the Hawaiian word and butchering it. Wayne,
Manao.
are you coming to my rescue? Manao. There, I knew I was
Manao.
saying incorrectly.
Thoughts, feelings.
So thank you, Erica, for your thoughts and feelings and helping us understand what's going on broader. I hope that some of y'all saw of your churches reflected within this survey as well and can help understand where you are in terms of what most people did, or maybe what a smaller group did because things were not available to them. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon here. Erica, have a great evening, and sometime in the future, we'll hope to see each other in person then.
I hope so. Thank you, everyone.
Ahoy ho, everybody.
Aloha all.